Good evening and welcome to Facebook Live. I'm Rafael Sanchez with RTV6's Indie Channels and RTV6 apps. Jordan Fischer, digital producer and reporter. We are in Allen County in Fort Wayne. We've been covering the Richmond Hill trial, the second trial here in Allen County involving Bob Leonard Jr. Today, the prosecution's star witness, Monserrate Shirley, took the stand. The first time really that the jury has heard someone say, hey, he was connected to this. And so it was a big day in court today as we covered this trial. Again, day 13. Your impressions, Jordan, this is our second trial. We covered the one in South Bend. But your impressions on this day as viewers can join our conversation. If you have any questions about the trial, some inside information, of course, we've been covering it now for 2 years. Last year in South Bend, now in Fort Wayne. Any questions that you may have for us, please join the discussion tonight on Facebook Live.
Right,
so impressions on the trial today?
Yeah, the trial so far has pretty well followed the same script as the first trial. And Monserrate Shirley's testimony, at least as far as the prosecution was concerned, followed suit. They had her lay out the alleged plot step by step, how she met Mark Leonard, his insistence that she increase her insurance coverage, and then his suggestion that they, at the time, burned down her house to collect the $300,000 policy. From the defense's perspective, they also started off in the same way that Mark Ray Leonard's defense did, which was sort of attacking Monserrate Shirley's character, her believability. But obviously they had different objectives because Bob Leonard is not as obviously tied to her. Mark Ray Leonard was dating Monserrate Shirley. He was living in the house. Bob Leonard's connection is not as obvious. And so they really kind of hammered in the idea that everything Monserrate Shirley said connecting Bob Leonard to this case, she heard from Mark Leonard.
We should point out that Jameson King just joined the conversation. He says, what's going on? And Jameson, what's going on is, of course, that this is one of the biggest trials to really impact Indiana. We had one yet last year with Mark Ray Leonard. Now his brother Bob Leonard is in trial in Fort Wayne. We've been covering this trial now for 2 years, basically, something that started back in 2012. 2 people were killed, more than 30 homes damaged or destroyed, millions of dollars in damages. So we want to give you an inside look at what happened in court today, because we were in court covering 7 hours of testimony as the prosecution's key witness obviously began her testimony today at 9 this morning. So we want to give you an inside look as to what happened in court today. We often don't get to chat and give you a sort of a raw view of what we're hearing, what we're seeing. But you've been keeping a blog, though, Jordan.
Sure.
So viewers at home have been able to at least get a sense for what is happening in this courtroom. Though in South Bend we were able to give you that blog right on the spot. This judge has chosen not to do that. So the blog is a little delayed, but you're giving us an inside look nonetheless.
Yeah, what you can see is, so no laptops in the courtroom this time.
Whatsoever.
So actually
Old
handwriting
school.
notes.
Old school.
Like we used to in high school, and then typing them. So obviously, today's transcript is not up yet, just because I'm here talking to you guys.
So let's answer Casey. Casey Crabtree has a question.
Yeah.
She wouldn't be trying to get a lighter sentence, would she? Maybe. Part of her deal, Casey, is that part of the plea deal, because she has a deal,
Sure.
right? Her deal was to turn on her ex-boyfriend, and the brother is she has to perform. She has to be able to help the prosecution get another conviction,
Right.
and the possible sentence in this case is what?
Yeah, the possible sentence range is 20 years to 50 years, potentially with those 20 years on the lower end being suspendable because she doesn't have any prior felony convictions. And that's something the defense really hammered on today, is that she could, theoretically, at the end of all these trials after testifying, be sentenced to be released, basically.
Yeah, and that is really the worst case scenario, and really unlikely. I think Judge Carlisle is much about law and order,
Sure.
and despite what Monserrate Shirley has to offer in helping with the convictions, and there's still 2 other trials after this one possibly, I'm going to presume that there'll be some jail time. It's unlikely that this lady will just walk free into the sunset.
And
So
of course,
she'll get some
she's
jail
already been in jail for more than 2 years at this point.
she's
too.
been in jail, in fact, since December the 21st of 2012, when she and the other 2 were arrested. So she's been in jail, and she will remain in custody for some time.
Shelley Lear here is asking, I wonder if they're found guilty, how many years they will get. Mark Ray Leonard, the first defendant, obviously was already found guilty. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 75 years.
So he's going to die in state prison.
Right. Bob Leonard also faces, this is a capital case, so he also faces the life without parole enhancement. Prosecutors chose not to go for the death penalty in this case. Monserrate Shirley, part of the reason she took the plea agreement was to avoid that life without parole enhancement. So, like we said a second ago, 50 years would be the max for her. I don't remember off the top of my head all the charges that the other defendants are facing. I don't believe that they are facing the capital enhancement.
They're not. So when we're talking about the Monserrate Shirley, who testified today, she's 50 years old. So if she gets 30 years in prison, she'd get out at 80 or maybe 75. She'd be an older person, right? A senior citizen by the time she got out. She was on the stand today for 7 hours. There was some cross-examination, and during the cross-examination by the defense team, of course, Ted Minch, who represents Bob Leonard Jr., made it a key point to point out, to characterize her as a liar, to make sure that the jury knew that she wasn't always truthful. And in this case, which is very interesting, we have to have a unanimous verdict.
Right.
If one juror believed that Monserrate Shirley wasn't telling the truth and believed that maybe Bob Leonard should get a break, that could throw everything off. But we should also point out is that we have more than 100 witnesses who also testified, including public safety, including homeowners who are convincing. And so the testimony of one woman doesn't make it all up.
Sure.
So I think in this case, I would be shocked.
Sure. Well, what the prosecution said last time is that they didn't feel like they needed Monserrate to make their case. They could make it without her. But obviously, they felt that it was stronger with her. We have a couple questions. People asking about whether insurance fraud was one of the motives. That is the stated motive. Mark Ray Leonard's attorneys even said as much in his trial. Their argument was that the plan was to create a small fire, as they said, basically to burn down her house. But I don't think at any point there's been any disagreement about that, about whether the motive was insurance fraud.
Yeah, she increased her contents from $150,000 to $304,000 months before the actual explosion. As so far as money, she was able to get $5,000 out of State Farm because after the explosion, she claimed that she was a victim. So State Farm, like many of the insurance companies, did provide some dollars, $5,000 to be exact, to help with some of the emergency needs. And so she was able to get some money out of that, but she did not collect on the $300,000. We have other questions.
Yeah, Dawn Smithhart, hopefully I said your name right, is asking what's going on. She just joined. So we're here in Fort Wayne. It's day 13 of the trial of Bob Leonard Jr., who was one of the alleged conspirators in the Richmond Hill explosion, 2012. Today, Monserrate Shirley testified. She is one of his co-defendants. She is the woman who owned and lived at the house that did explode.
We have a comment from Marilyn who says that this cannot allow her to be free. That would be a travesty for those who died. She knew what she was doing. And, that is really the argument that the defense made today in telling the jury, look, this lady, she got a deal, and yes, she helped with the conviction of her boyfriend, but she knew what was going on. And we heard today, though, her reasoning for not stepping forward was that she said she was scared that her boyfriend threatened to cut her up into pieces, and her daughter, her young daughter, and that her body would not be found. And so
she said repeatedly that she was scared of Mark Leonard. She did everything he asked her to the word, and she said also that he did threaten Brooke, her daughter, who was 13 at the time. We have a question from former RTV6 intern Andy Tinbarge has a question for us. Is there a possibility that her ex-husband might testify against her? John Shirley did. He did testify earlier this week.
He did. And actually, she tried to throw him under the bus by suggesting that he threatened her and all this other stuff. And so you have to really, in any trial, as you can imagine, you have to weigh that information. There's no validity to
I actually think
no
we didn't hear that at the last trial.
We did not. We did not.
But she said today, and the defense asked her about this, that she had suggested early on, initially in an interview with police who asked her if anyone might have a reason to harm her. She said, well, I have a restraining order against my ex-husband, who's John Shirley. She reportedly said in a phone conversation with several family members that she thought he could be involved. He had previously, I guess, made a threat against her, she said. Of course, there doesn't seem to be
No evidence.
no evidence that he was connected at all.
Shelley Lair says, why has it taken so long to take him to trial? Shelley, there are over 150 witnesses. As you may recall, this explosion was so huge that it took days just to gather. There are thousands of pieces of evidence. There are boxes of documentation. Not only was Metro Police involved, Indianapolis Fire Department was involved, EMS, ATF. Considering how big the explosion was and really one of the largest criminal cases in Indiana history,
Right.
the ATF, once they unsealed the records, and this goes to public safety, did an amazing job. So those are just facts. They knew that this was a criminal case
Right.
within 48 to 72 hours. So as you can imagine, an entire neighborhood, densely populated, had become really like a war zone. Remember, some of the people even that had come back from Afghanistan said that,
Right.
that the imagery reminded them of serving in Afghanistan. Considering how big the crime scene was, Shelley, it's taken this long because of all the evidence. It's been a long time taking all the stuff and putting it all together.
We have John Carbook. He likes your bow tie.
Okay,
So
thank you, John.
maybe I'll have to get one for the
Next
next
time.
round. We had another question. Someone's asking, when is Monserrate Shirley going to go to trial?
Never.
Because she took a deal with the state, she will not go before a jury. She will go before a judge for her sentencing eventually in Marion County, and the judge will decide how much time she spends in prison.
Let's see what Lindsay Koff, Melissa, Nathan Schneider. I think they should get life without parole. They took innocent people's lives when they did this, and you're right about that. There were two innocent people, and that would be Dion and Jennifer Longworth.
Right.
Dion was an avid lover of electronics. He was just a smart guy. He loved sunflowers. Jennifer Longworth was an amazing second-grade teacher in the Greenwood Public School System that is south of Indianapolis. For those of you that don't live in the Indianapolis area, both loved good people. They loved the Colts. They loved their parents. And then you had all the neighbors. There were a number of neighbors that were injured, an entire neighborhood that was just shell-shocked, right? And so many people are still trying to recover. And while that neighborhood is amazing, if you go to Richmond Hill, the people there are just simply awesome because they've been able to, despite that tragedy, they are moving forward. They're trying, and when I say moving forward, I don't mean to be callous, that they haven't forgotten what happened, but they're trying to obviously make things better.
Sure. One of the things that struck out to me when you talk about kind of expanding the impact of this is how many people who testified who didn't live in the neighborhood also had a personal connection to it. And we see that in the comments on our stories all the time. People felt the explosion. They heard it. We heard earlier in this trial dozens of 911 calls. There were more than 200 911 calls made that night. So we heard several dozen of them. People who were genuinely scared. They thought someone was breaking into their house. They thought maybe a drunk driver hit their house. One elderly woman called and was terrified, basically, based on the call. She thought someone was breaking in to harm her, and she didn't know what to do.
Yeah, the explosion was felt as far away as Shelby County and Beech Grove. Initially, when I arrived on the scene that night, I've been covering the story that long, as people were coming out of the neighborhood, initially they thought that a plane had crashed into one of the homes because the Greenwood Municipal Airport is very close to that area. Some of the folks thought maybe a meteor had hit the home. There was a lot of different stories because no one could really comprehend that someone would turn a home, 8349 Field Fairway, into a bomb. And literally what happened, based on the accounts, is that they filled a home with gas up to it was equal to about 3 tons of TNT.
The calculation was anywhere from 3 to 5 tons of TNT.
And that someone had actually planned this out, not just on one weekend, but they had been planning this out for 2 previous weekends before November the 10th of 2012. And so who could even think that? I mean, no one thought that. So they really thought it was a plane or a meteor, or that it was actually just a natural gas explosion. It was not a natural gas explosion in the sense that no line had broken in that neighborhood.
Right.
This was a man-made disaster.
It wasn't what the utility would call a jurisdictional problem, which is to say a problem on the utilities end, like you said.
And so when he uses the word jurisdictional, you could tell we've been covering this trial so much that I think we know a lot about natural gas and those kinds of things because we've had to learn as well about what happened. We see Stacey Ward says it's senseless, it's a shame that it's taken so long to get a trial. And you're right about that. I think folks in that neighborhood, wish that this would have been a little bit faster, but also, our system of justice requires that these people have a right to a fair trial, and that's sometimes very difficult to balance because individuals have a right to get an attorney and get all the facts and witnesses and experts to defend them. Whether you like that or not, I'm going to leave that up to you, but that is the right of every individual to have that, and I think that's also prolonged this case.
It's kind of just what we were talking about. A comment right here. Dawn Pratt Wood says her house shook from the explosion. Just all around Indianapolis, people felt it. Even up in Lawrence, they were getting calls about it.
Yeah, so Kevin has a good question here. Why are we talking about these people? Convict them and send them away. He goes on to say that chick is just as guilty, even though she is trying to cooperate. He goes on to say other things that I can't repeat, and then he says all of them are murderers. And obviously, Kevin, a lot of people feel the way that you do as well. But there's a trial going on, and we're talking about it just to give an inside look to the things that we don't get to report on every single detail. We're hoping to have that conversation so that if you do have questions, we could share them with you.
And again, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the Richmond Hill explosion trial here in Fort Wayne. Bob Leonard Jr. is the defendant. He is accused of being part of the group that planned out the explosion that ultimately killed 2 people and damaged nearly 100 homes, more than 100 homes.
Yeah, this trial was moved to Fort Wayne because of all the pretrial publicity in the Indianapolis area. So Fort Wayne, for those of you who are not from Indiana and joining us, is about it's 2.5 hours away from the Richmond Hill neighborhood. So this trial was moved here in hopes of finding a better or a fairer jury. But I have to point out that when the jury selection began, as you may recall, the jury knew what happened in Indianapolis 4 years ago.
Right.
Now, they didn't have all the facts, but no one, when asked, basically, are any of you living under a rock and knew nothing about this? No one said, what are you talking about? They all knew something about what was happening in Indianapolis.
Here's an interesting question from interesting to me. Aaron Blaney Newland asks, does causing death while committing a felony up the severity? So one of the things that was a big issue in the last trial, and probably will be in this trial, is something that's called felony murder. So in Indiana and many other states, if a death occurs, basically, while you are committing a felony, regardless of whether that is your intended victim or one of your accomplices, or, as it was in this case, an innocent bystander, you can be charged with what's called felony murder, which carries the equivalent of a murder charge, but isn't a capital offense. And so in the previous trial, one of the issues was whether Mark Ray Leonard would be convicted of knowing murder and felony murder, and knowing murder carries the life without parole or potentially death penalty sentence, or simply felony murder, which is I think is a level 1 felony, but does not carry the capital enhancement on it. So I suppose the answer is yes. It doesn't necessarily increase the severity of the initial felony, but it does allow prosecutors to add the felony murder charge.
And of course, that's what they were seeking from the get-go. Obviously, there was a discussion about was this a death penalty case or not, and so some discussions. The prosecutor's office does use a matrix in this, and they follow through, and they go through a series of questions before they determine which cases should go through that. This case is supposed to last until at least March the 4th. We're getting some indication that possibly the prosecution may wrap up their case either next week or the week after, which makes this case really much faster than anticipated.
Sure.
And we saw the same thing in South Bend. That trial was expected to go about 6 weeks. It only went for about 20 days. But that trial had many more of their issues than this one. This one is moving much smoother. And as you may recall, the defense in the first trial last summer only put on the case for 42 minutes. We're not sure whether or not Bob Leonard Jr. will take the stand. He made a lot of phone calls to us before the trial, so he may want to speak. We'll see if that happens, but that has not been shared with us just yet as to what the defense plans to do.
Right. My dad says great coverage and awesome Q&A. Thank you, Dad. Appreciate it.
That's shameless when you gotta love your dad, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So we'll see what happens insofar as the trial, because this could be somewhat over next week. The jury, we were surprised in the first trial. The jury went out around noon. And was back in about 3 hours.
Yeah.
Their verdict was shorter than the running of the Indianapolis 500. So
right, and you have to consider they have 52 charges to consider in that. Although many of them were connected to one another, it's hard to imagine having found him guilty of arson of one of the houses and not the other ones. again, the big issue was the knowing versus the felony murder charges.
And I think the instructions to the jury were about 80 pages. What I found so strange about that, I'm not a lawyer, is when the judge told them you can't allow emotion
Right.
to play into your decision, which is hard to do because here you are in a courtroom for 5-6 weeks. You're hearing about death and destruction, and then you're telling the jury to not allow emotion.
Right.
That's kind of hard. I mean, as a human being, you're saying, "What, are you kidding me? I mean, something terrible happened, and I can't feel empathy."
Right.
And that's part of the rules. You cannot feel empathy, or you cannot allow emotions to play into the decision. So we've been following this trial. We hope to bring you many more updates as sort of the bigger witnesses take the stand. We'll be continuing day 14 tomorrow when court goes into session tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
Right.
And of course, we'll keep you updated on the RTV6 app. We appreciate your time here on Facebook Live. Again, I'm with Jordan Fischer. He's our digital producer for RTV6, and I'm Rafael Sanchez, a reporter also at RTV6. So we thank you for sharing your time with us in the dialogue, and we appreciate your time tonight. We hope that you have a good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on Facebook Live. Thank you.
Have a great night.